Okay, so I'm fascinated by this quote. I will either find a way or make one. It's Hannibal Barca, right?
Yes, indeed. Powerful statement, isn't it? It gets right to the heart of what we're all about, I think.
Right. Navigating uncertain situations, maybe even like really tough ones. Having that drive to find your own way when the path ahead, it's not clear.
Absolutely. Overcoming obstacles. And that's exactly what we are diving into in this deep dive, specifically tailored for you today.
Yeah, we're looking at Hannibal's risk management philosophy, the mind of a general.
Drawing from the insights of Giles Smith II, who brings a wealth of experience to the table, over 35 years, actually, in the world of risk management. And he sees this kind of timeless model in Hannibal Barca.
Now, at first glance, I'll admit, it might seem a little bit odd, connecting ancient military strategy to today's business world, or even just like everyday professional life.
I get it. War and business, they can feel like completely different universes. And Smith actually acknowledges that potential skepticism right up front. But here's the thing. The core idea, the one that we found really resonated with us, is that risk management, at its very core, is a challenge that transcends any specific situation.
Right. You're dealing with uncertainty, you're trying to understand it, you're figuring out how to handle it, and maybe even how to turn it to your advantage.
Absolutely. Whether you are facing a major career decision, launching a new venture, or, yes, even leading an army, those core principles of dealing with risk, they're remarkably consistent. They're universal.
Okay, so that's what we're going to unpack today. What crucial insights can we learn from Hannibal's life, from his campaigns, insights that can actually give us a new way to think about risk and how to deal with it in our own lives? Could be your professional world, your business, even your personal choices. We want to give you those aha moments.
Exactly. And the book is structured in a very helpful way. 3 parts. First, laying the foundations, understanding what risk really is. Then we move into the dynamics of risk in action. So seeing how these principles play out in the real world.
In the heat of battle, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, extracting those lessons that are still relevant today, the modern lessons from an ancient strategist.
Perfect. So are we ready to jump into part 1? The foundations.
Let's dive in.
Okay, so the first thing Smith focuses on is this interplay between boldness and calculation. It's fascinating. Hannibal, he had these incredible successes, but they weren't just the result of, like, him being impulsive. There was a method to the madness.
Exactly. It wasn't just about making daring moves for the sake of it. And Smith ties this directly to what we call risk appetite today. And just so you know, in the world of risk management, risk appetite is formally defined. ISO 31000.2018.
Oh, wow. They have a whole standard for this.
They do. It's defined as the amount and type of risk that an organization is willing to pursue or retain. So Hannibal, clearly he had a significant risk appetite. But it was strategic, not reckless.
So the classic example here, the one everyone thinks of, is his crossing of the Alps. I mean, that is just wild. An entire army, elephants and all, over those mountains, it seems almost impossible.
Right. And what's really striking is that when you look at the historical accounts from writers like Polybius and Livy, it's clear this was meticulously planned, gathering intelligence about the terrain, forging alliances with the tribes who lived along the route.
Smart. You need those local guides.
Absolutely. And making sure the troops were prepared as they could be for those incredibly harsh conditions. So this was not someone just acting on a whim. This was a calculated risk. A huge gamble, yes, but with a lot of forethought.
A lot of preparation behind it. Okay, so that's a key takeaway here. Smith emphasizes the importance of developing a risk appetite framework, figuring out what level of risk you are comfortable with, making sure it aligns with what you're actually trying to achieve.
Yes. Boldness, yes, but grounded in a clear understanding of what you're willing to risk and why.
Now, you mentioned the difference between a calculated risk and just being reckless. How does Smith distinguish those two?
It's crucial to understand that difference. A calculated risk, even if it has a high potential reward, it's based on careful evaluation. You're looking at the situation, trying to minimize the potential downsides.
You have a plan if things go wrong.
Exactly. Recklessness, on the other hand, it's more like a blind gamble, often taken without any real understanding of what could go wrong, or without a plan to deal with those consequences.
Okay, so with the Alps, all that planning, all those efforts to prepare, that's what separated from being just reckless. So what about another famous Hannibal moment? The Battle of Cannae, that double envelopment maneuver. I mean, that sounds incredibly risky.
It was undeniably bold, high risk, but again, rooted in a deep understanding of the Roman military, their psychology, the dynamics of the battlefield itself. Hannibal had studied their tendencies, their strengths, their weaknesses.
So he knew how they would likely react.
Exactly. And he used that knowledge to his advantage. Remember Sun Tzu, all warfare is based on deception. Hannibal's strategy at Cannae, it relied heavily on this idea, deceiving the enemy, outmaneuvering them. It wasn't just a random act of daring, it was a calculated exploitation of the situation.
So high-risk tactic, but based on a very strong rationale. Now, Smith also talks about strategic risks in business. He uses a definition from Kaplan and Mikes, which is helpful.
They define strategic risks as those that arise from the fundamental decisions a company makes about its objectives and how it will achieve them. Think about Hannibal's big decisions, like crossing the Alps, or the tactics he used at Cannae.
All driven by that ultimate goal.
Exactly, the defeat of Rome. In business, it's the same idea. The biggest risks often come from those core strategic choices. Where's the company going? How is it going to get there?
Okay, so having a clear vision is essential. And Smith argues that Hannibal's unwavering focus on defeating Rome, that really shaped his willingness to take those risks. How does that apply today to, a business or a professional setting?
It's about having that clear objective. It becomes the lens through which you evaluate your options. You're willing to take big risks if they serve that ultimate goal. Peter Drucker, he said, the purpose of a business is to create a customer, and the purpose of a leader is to create a vision that inspires others to follow.
Right, you need that vision.
And the CSO-ERM framework, they emphasize that risk management is not an end in itself. It is a means to achieving the organization's objectives.
So no vision, no way to judge which risks are actually worth taking. Okay, last point in this foundational section. Smith talks about the cultural and historical influences on Hannibal's approach to risk. What shaped his thinking?
This is fascinating. So Carthage, they were a maritime power, long history of trade, exploration. That kind of background, it probably instilled a greater comfort with risk-taking compared to a more, let's say, landlocked culture.
Right, you're out there on the open sea, facing the unknown.
Exactly. Plus, their history with Rome, particularly that painful defeat in the First Punic War, that fueled Hannibal's determination and shaped his willingness to take risks. It was seen as a necessity to avenge that loss. Polybius, the historian, he wrote about Hannibal's strong sense of duty to his city.
So his background, that history of conflict, it all played a role. And how does Smith connect that to modern organizations?
He says that an organization's own culture, their past experiences, their successes, their failures, their beliefs about how things should be done.
Their values.
Exactly. All of that impacts their approach to risk. He even references Geert Hofstede's work on cultural dimensions to illustrate how these ingrained cultural factors, they really influence how willing an organization is to embrace risk.
Okay, that gives us a great understanding of Hannibal's mindset. Now let's move on to part 2, the dynamics of risk in action. The first point is about timing. Calculated boldness in timing. Smith brings up the Alps crossing again. Why was the timing so crucial there?
Because it was winter, and the Romans, they just didn't expect an army to attempt such a crossing during that season. It was a masterstroke of surprise. Gave Hannibal a huge advantage right from the start.
Bold move, amplified by the element of surprise. And Livy, he actually wrote about this, that Hannibal struck when his enemies were least prepared. So how does that principle of timing apply today? In business, for example.
Timing is everything. Launching a product, entering a new market, making a move against a competitor, the timing can determine whether you succeed or fail.
It can make all the difference.
Right. The PMBOK guide, the project management body of knowledge, they stress the importance of continuous risk management throughout a project. Taking action at the optimal time.
Makes sense. And Peter Drucker, he had that famous quote, the best way to predict the future is to create it.
Exactly. Decisive action at the right moment, that's how you shape the future. And a key takeaway here for our listeners is using risk assessment tools. Evaluate those opportunities. Make sure your bold decisions align with your long-term goals.
So not just acting on impulse. You've got a plan. Now, we talked a bit about Hannibal weighing the odds. Can you elaborate on his risk assessment process? Especially in those high-pressure, uncertain situations.
It's incredible how Hannibal, in a time without all our fancy tools and technology, was able to assess probabilities, potential outcomes. I mean, think about the Battle of Cannae. Outnumbered by the Romans, but he didn't just charge in headfirst. He carefully assessed the situation.
So strengths and weaknesses, both his own and the enemy's.
Exactly. The terrain, the psychological factors. It was a real analytical process, even if it wasn't formalized the way we do it today. Karl von Clausewitz, he wrote, "In war, everything is uncertain, But the commander who can best assess the risks and act decisively will prevail. That was Hannibal.
So not just intuition, a real process of analyzing the situation. And how does that relate to risk assessment in the business world today?
Well, the Skihuso framework, they define risk assessment as the identification and analysis of risk to the achievement of objectives, providing a basis for determining how risks should be managed. The methods we use today, they're much more sophisticated, of course.
Right, we have all these tools and models now.
But the fundamental principle remains the same. Evaluate the risks, weigh the potential rewards before you make those critical decisions. Warren Buffett, he said it best, I think. Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing.
That's a great quote. So understand the situation. That's key. The next point Smith makes is about courage as a strategic asset. How did Hannibal's boldness actually change the dynamics of the competition?
It's fascinating. His audacity often forced the Romans to react in ways that actually played into his hands. For example, his decision to march on Rome itself.
Even though he couldn't actually conquer it at that point.
Right. But that move, it was so bold, it forced the Romans to divert resources, to shift their attention. He kept them off balance, and that created opportunities for him.
So he was dictating the terms of engagement.
In a way, yes. And this idea, it relates to the concept of strategic intent in business, creating this ambitious vision that drives you to achieve what might seem impossible.
Like what Steve Jobs said, innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower.
Exactly. Now, Smith provides some great modern-day examples of this. Elon Musk with Tesla and SpaceX.
Both incredibly risky ventures.
Absolutely. Huge investments, long odds, but driven by a strategic vision. Musk said, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. And Reed Hastings with Netflix?
That shift from DVD rentals to streaming, that was a bold move.
It was, and it paid off. Hastings believed that risk-taking is essential for innovation and growth, very similar to Hannibal's understanding of risk and reward.
So these weren't just reckless gambles, they were strategic, with the potential for huge impact. Okay, next section is about knowing the enemy. Competitive risk. Hannibal is a master of intelligence gathering. What can we learn from his approach?
It's remarkable how he did it, without any of the technology we have today. He built an effective intelligence network, spies, scouts, informants, even double agents, to gather information about the Romans, their movements, their strategies, even their morale. The ambush at Lake Trasimene is a great example.
He knew exactly where they would be.
Exactly. Polemius wrote that Hannibal's success was largely due to his ability to get accurate intelligence and then act on it.
So how does that apply to the modern business world?
It's about having good information, accurate and timely information, to make the right decisions. ISO 31000 actually highlights this. And whether you're analyzing market trends, watching your competitors, or assessing your own vulnerabilities, good intelligence gathering is essential.
It's like that Peter Drucker quote, what gets measured gets managed.
Precisely. And the takeaway here is to invest in competitive intelligence. Conduct SWOT analyses regularly. That's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Understand your landscape.
Okay, that leads us to the idea of predicting competitor behavior. How did Hannibal get so good at anticipating the Romans' moves and then exploiting their weaknesses?
He understood human psychology. He could see their patterns, their tendencies, their moments of overconfidence. At Cannae, he actually created a seemingly weak center in his line, knowing the Romans would charge right into it.
Setting a trap.
Exactly. And then his flanking cavalry surrounded them. Sun Tzu said, "Know the enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril." That's exactly what Hannibal did. He shaped the battlefield based on his understanding of his enemy.
Like a chess master, thinking several moves ahead. And how does that apply to business today?
Think about Michael Porter's 5 forces. Understanding your competitive environment. Hannibal, he knew the Roman strengths and weaknesses, and he used that knowledge to disrupt the existing power dynamics. Warren Buffett, he said, "It's not whether you're right or wrong that's important, but how much money you make when you're right and how much you lose when you're wrong."
Minimize your losses, maximize your gains. That's smart. Now let's talk about SWOT analysis in the context of ancient warfare. How can we apply that to Hannibal's invasion of Italy?
It's actually a really interesting way to analyze his campaign. So his strengths: highly disciplined army, especially his cavalry, and his own tactical brilliance, of course.
Those are big strengths.
They are. But weaknesses: he lacked consistent reinforcements and supplies from Carthage. And operating so far from home, that created logistical challenges.
Right, supply lines are always a concern.
They are opportunities, the potential for Rome's allies to switch sides. And the internal divisions within Rome itself, those were things he could exploit. And threats. Well, the Romans had numerical superiority, and there was always the danger of being isolated, cut off.
Outnumbered and surrounded.
Exactly. Livy wrote about how Hannibal constantly adapted his strategy based on this ongoing evaluation. So even without a formal SWOT framework, that's essentially what he was doing.
He was analyzing the situation continuously.
Yeah.
And how does that relate to how businesses use SWOT analysis today?
It's the same principle. Hill and Westbrook, they describe SWOT analysis as a framework for identifying and analyzing the internal strengths and weaknesses of an organization and the external opportunities and threats that it faces. Hannibal's doing exactly that, and using that information to guide his decisions. Michael Porter, he had this great quote, "The essence of strategy is choosing what not to do."
So focus your efforts where they'll have the most impact. And Smith provides some modern parallels for this idea of competitive risk. Disruptive technologies, hostile takeovers. How do Hannibal's strategies connect to those?
Think of Hannibal's entire campaign as a kind of sustained disruptive attack, even a hostile takeover attempt in a way. He wanted to topple Rome from its dominant position, like how Netflix and Apple disrupted Blockbuster and Kodak.
New technologies, new business models, that's Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma.
Exactly. Hannibal's tactics, they disrupted the Roman status quo, and Bruce Wasserstein, he wrote about hostile takeovers as these high-stakes strategic games.
Involving huge risk.
Right, and that echoes Hannibal's campaign. Jeff Bezos, he said, "Your margin is my opportunity." That's that aggressive, competitive mindset.
So, different battlefields, but the underlying strategic principles are similar. The next section is about embracing the impossible. Back to the Alps crossing. What's the key lesson there for us today?
It's not just about boldness, it's about challenging those perceived limitations, overcoming what others say can't be done. The Alps crossing, it wasn't just about getting the army into Italy, it sent a message to the Romans.
The psychological blow.
Exactly. It showed them that Hannibal was willing to defy conventional wisdom. Livy wrote about how this inspired his troops and demoralized the enemy. This relates to disruptive innovation in business, challenging the norms, creating new markets, new opportunities, like Christensen talked about. And Steve Jobs, he said innovation is what separates leaders from followers.
Seeing possibilities where others see only obstacles.
Yeah.
But Smith also talks about the logistical nightmare of the Alps crossing. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision.
Oh, absolutely not. The logistics were mind-boggling. Supplying an army, moving elephants across treacherous terrain, forging alliances for safe passage and supplies, navigating unknown territory. Polybius actually wrote about Hannibal's incredible logistical skills.
So bold vision, yes, but backed up by meticulous planning.
Exactly. That's where effectiveness comes in. Doing the right things, making sure the army was even capable of attempting that crossing.
Okay, so a huge logistical undertaking. And then there's the leadership aspect. Keeping morale high during such a difficult ordeal. How did Hannibal do that?
It's remarkable. Inspiring his troops through unimaginable hardship, he shared in their suffering, led from the front, and communicated a clear sense of purpose.
Leading by example.
Exactly. Livy wrote about his ability to inspire, even in the face of adversity. This ties into modern ideas about emotional intelligence in leadership. Daniel Goleman's work.
Right, being able to connect with people on an emotional level.
Yes. And John C. Maxwell, he said, people buy into the leader before they buy into the vision. That's so true.
So, strong leadership, even in the most difficult circumstances. Finally, Smith talks about the payoff and the unintended consequences of the Alps crossing. What are the lessons learned there?
It led to Hannibal's initial victories in Italy, but it came at a cost. Significant losses of troops and resources. Polybius documented this, and it highlights a crucial point about high-risk strategies.
High reward, high risk.
Exactly. The potential downsides can be huge, both the anticipated ones and the ones you don't see coming. Kaplan and Mikes, they emphasize the importance of analyzing all potential outcomes. And remember Warren Buffett's quote about the risk of not knowing what you're doing. Even a successful move can have unforeseen consequences.
Okay, so a complex set of outcomes to consider. We've covered a lot of ground in part 2. Now, part 3, Smith gets into the modern applications of all this. That's where it all comes together for our listeners, right?
It is, bridging the gap between ancient strategies and the challenges we face today. Practical ways to apply these timeless lessons.
Perfect. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Hannibal's risk management philosophy. It seems his approach was all about calculated boldness, Understanding your competitors, being adaptable and resilient.
Absolutely. Learning from setbacks and having strategic patience, knowing when to act and when to wait.
Right, sometimes waiting is the smartest move. And we hope you, our listeners, are seeing how these principles, they go way beyond the battlefield. They offer valuable insights for any aspects of life.
Whether it's your career, your business, or your personal choices, more than just military history, it's about practical, actionable insights.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. Hannibal, he had this amazing strategic patience. He knew when to strike. So ask yourself this. In what area of your own life, your work, could you benefit from taking a longer-term perspective, from being more patient? Could that lead to unexpected advantages?
It's a great question to ponder.
It is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as insightful as we did.